whatever happened in the translation between my computer and up here, the formatting is not going to work. So sometimes the font is going to be really small, and sometimes it's going to be large enough for you to read. So if you want to read the slides, I would encourage you to sit closer. And again, I apologize, we don't know why these aren't formatting correctly, but they're not. So why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Debbie Whaley. I'm the pastor at Mount Washington Presbyterian Church. And let me welcome all of you to this second presentation on how did we get here. And this is a discussion of the Israeli-Gaza war. And what we've been looking at last week, we looked at the Israeli narrative. And this week, we're looking at the Palestinian narrative. And we'll talk a little bit about what those words kind of mean. So just a reminder, next week we'll be talking about peacemaking and what does that look like, sort of Christian peacemaking. And so that will also include Jewish and Muslim peacemaking perspectives. But I'm going to approach it how Christians are doing peacemaking, especially in the Holy Land. So just a reminder that we're talking about this area of land. Israel proper is actually lengthier than this map, but this sort of tells you where we're zeroing in. You know, I keep talking about the kidney bean, and you guys remember what the kidney bean is? The West Bank, right? And the little strip down on the coast that's Gaza. And so where all this conflict right now is centered is in Gaza, although there's an impact that's been happening in the war in the West Bank. I won't have a chance to go into all of those details tonight, but just so you know, it's impacting the whole region and Palestinians throughout the whole region. So I just want to remind you about what my commitment is as I'm talking about these things. I really do believe that peacemaking involves honoring and engaging the narrative of all groups that are in conflict. And that comes from my conviction that as a Christian, all of humanity matters. There's not a division between somebody who's from one ethnic group or one nationality has more value than another, but that all people are created in the image of God and all hold value just because they're breathing and they're human. And so in that, from my Christian faith, I also believe that Christ is central in modeling this type of behavior. And so here's a quote from Ephesians 2. So Christ is our peace. In his body, he has made Jewish and non-Jewish people in his body, I can't read my own writing, he has made Jewish and non-Jewish people one by breaking down the walls of his hostility that has kept them apart. And so this is my conviction. It comes deeply out of my faith that peace is possible. And I will tell you that the affirmation that all are created in the image of God is not unique to Christianity. It's a core belief in Judaism as well as Islam. So when we talk about peacemaking next week, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So what I want to make sure that we understand is what we're doing here. I'm not giving a historical account of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or what's happened, although there are facts involved in the way I'm telling it. What I'm doing instead is talking about narrative. But let's just talk about what history means, just for a moment to define the terms. History is the academic study of the human past, and it stresses objectivity. It acknowledges issues of power, like social power, physical power, military power, all those kinds of things, historical power. And the historian, when they tell the story, they're standing outside of the story as an objective observer trying to make sense of those facts. But when we talk about narrative, when we talk about narrative, at some point we're going to talk about narrative. Claire, the slides are not advancing. Can you advance it for me? We're on history versus narrative, and this should say narrative at the top. This is just not going to be my night tonight, I can already tell. There we go. And so Claire, it looks like you may need to advance these slides for me, so I'm going to keep putting up my finger when I need you to do that. Narrative, on the other hand, is the story that a group tells about itself. It's the way we tell the story. So it's subjective, and it talks about the group identity and its meaning. It defines heroes and villains, and the stakeholder is the protagonist. So let me give you an example of narrative. Some of you have had long-term relationships or some romantic relationship, right? Now, when you tell the story to your children, perhaps, about how you first fell in love, you tell selective pieces of bits of that story, don't you? You don't tell about the fact that the first time you met that person, you might have been put off or whatever, but you craft a story that tells the story of love and commitment to each other. That's a narrative. Historical fact would be, on this day we went out the first time, the second time we did this, the third time we went to this restaurant and did these things. But when you tell the story to your children, you may say, we sat for hours that first time we had dinner together, right? And I knew just the way that we shared and that thing, I just felt my heart going pitter patter, pitter patter. That's narrative. That's not, it's part of history, but it's the way we tell the stories about ourselves. But let's just remember that in narrative, there are power dynamics. So the group in power controls the perception and imposes that perception on others. So if you are the group that has the most airtime in the press, if you're the person who has the loudest voice or perhaps have a following, you get to control the narrative that you tell. But the group that does not have that kind of power struggles. They struggle even for the right to be heard, to define the narrative, to defend the narrative, and protect their narrative against the group in power. So when we're talking about the power dynamics right now, about the Israeli-Palestinian narratives, we talked about Israel last week, in our country, who do you imagine has the most power in telling the story? What do you think? Israel or Palestine? In telling the story of what's going on right now? I hope you say Israel. It's dominated in the press. They are the group in power. And so Palestinian voices often struggle to have their narrative heard, much less understood or affirmed. So again, this is this power dynamic that's going to happen. As a result, as I'm talking about the Palestinian narrative, I'm going to get closer to a bunch of stuff and a lot of details because I'm telling their story, and their story involves, in their case, many examples of injustice. And even while, so you're going to be overwhelmed with a lot of details. But even as I say that, in both of these narratives, remember, I'm going to stay up at like the 20,000 foot level. I'm not going to talk about everything because I can't possibly. In both of these stories, as I said last week, if you were to explore the Israeli narrative in detail, it would fill volumes. If you were to explore the Palestinian narrative, it would fill volumes. But tonight, you're going to hear a lot about the Palestinian narrative because they're wanting not the general arch of their story told, but also the details that support their understanding of this narrative. So let's keep going, and I want to tell you my story. I have a story too. I have a narrative. And so my story is that in terms of the Jewish people in Israel, I grew up in the United States. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical Christian home. Going to an evangelical Christian church, I went to a Bible college. And so for me, growing up, the Jews in Israel, I was socially accepting of Jewish people. They've been a part of my family life since I was very young. I knew a lot of Jewish people. I also celebrated things like Passover with Jewish neighbors and friends. I was also religiously, as a Christian, very supportive of the state of Israel. I had never heard that there would be any other way. God gave them back the land, and that's what I believed. And then I was also politically endorsing of anything that the state of Israel was all about. I was there, I had my hand raised, I was ready to support them. Now, the other part of my story, though, was how did I view Arabs? And in the earlier years of my life, I was ignorant. I would say up until my 50s, my mid-50s, I had really never met a Muslim person that I knew was Muslim. I also thought my memories were that Palestinians were all terrorists. I remembered things like the Olympic Games. I remembered hijackings, and all I could think of was the word Palestinian terrorists were the same to me. And my assumption really was not just that Palestinians were terrorists, but that all Arabs were terrorists. These were unexamined assumptions that I had, but they were ones that I carried with me. And so I remember my first trip to Israel in 2010. We had been all over Israel proper, and now we were entering into Bethlehem for the first time, where we were going to the Church of the Nativity, the birthplace of Jesus. We were only going in our tour group only to spend about 2 or 3 hours in Bethlehem, and let me tell you, I was shaking. I was so nervous, because at the entrance to the checkpoint in Bethlehem is this sign. And I don't know that if you can see it, but the part that's circled says, it's in Hebrew and in Arabic, and then it says, "This road leads to Area A, under the Palestinian Authority. Entrance for Israeli citizens is forbidden, dangerous to your lives, and against Israeli law." And I thought, why are we going to a place that has a sign like that outside the entrance? And to make matters worse, as we entered into Bethlehem, a young soldier from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, boarded our bus. She was all about 19 years old, had an automatic weapon, and she checked all of our passports before they would let us go in. I thought this was the stupidest decision our tour company had made to lead us to go into Bethlehem. It fit every assumption I had. This is a dangerous place, a scary place. These Palestinians aren't to be trusted. Why on earth would we be going into the West Bank? Whoop. I don't know what happened to that slide. Well, there's a picture there. I don't know where it is. The question is, there's a picture of an apartment building that 2 years later I'm living in that same West Bank. I'm living in Bethlehem. What on earth happened between the time that I entered Bethlehem for the very first time and 2 years later I'm taking a 4-month sabbatical and I'm living in the West Bank? Something must have changed. In fact, I was so committed to feeling safe and there that in 2012, this is my family with their boyfriends who joined me on my sabbatical during Christmas. And for those of you who've traveled with me, you'll recognize the yacht in the background with his family. Not quite sure what happened to the sound there, but there you go. So what changed? Well, I'll tell you what happened. I met this particular man. His name is Reverend Dr. Johanna Catenaccio. He is a person that was a theologian who was speaking at a conference that our church was sponsoring. And he had all these words that described him that didn't make any sense to him. I got that he was an Arab, and I got that he was a Palestinian. I didn't understand that he could be a Christian, because to me, all Arabs were Muslim. I didn't understand at the time that Arab is a cultural designation, not a religious designation. Like many people in our country, when we hear Arab, we think Muslim, but the Arab culture is across all of Northern Africa, and Arab is distinct from a religious designation. So he's culturally Arab, meaning that's the language he speaks. He's Palestinian because of where he's from. He's from Nazareth, which is in Israel proper. He's a Christian because that's his religious designation, but he's also an Israeli citizen. I was like, wait a minute. Israeli means Jewish, right? No, it doesn't. So I had to sort this all out, and I had the great benefit of being Johanna's host for the weekend where he was speaking. And every evening I would pick him up and take him to the conference where he was speaking. And we would sit and he would explain patiently all these things about all these assumptions I had, and sort of began to set me on a road of deconstructing these assumptions. And I learned so much from Johanna. In this, I began to listen and to learn what is going on in this region, and what do I have to let go of, and what do I need to embrace in a different way, so that I can understand the people that are involved in this conflict. One of the things I immediately learned was a question you ask every Palestinian. The first thing you ask is, what's your family name? Because you always have to understand a person in terms of their family history. And this history is not like what we do with our genealogical studies. These are families that have meaning, and of the several Palestinian family names, you can almost always identify where they're from because their families are so important. So what's your family name is the thing you ask, and the second thing you ask is where you're from, because that's going to tell you where their land is. Because in Palestinian society, it's not like here in Cincinnati. What's the first question you ask? Where did you go to high school? Right? The first question you ask is to a Palestinian is, tell me about your family and tell me about where you're from. And that's because to a Palestinian, the land is everything. Land and family. So let's look and talk about some of these historic ties that Palestinians have to the land. So the fellahin are what would be the word for peasant farmers in that part of the world. And they farm differently than how we understand farming in the United States. As farms, they're collectively farming as a village. You have a village that's centralized, and then you have the farms and the orchards all around that village. And collectively, that village works together with one another and farms this land. These villages, you may wonder, so how does that work? Like with all these people, don't they fight or aren't they competitive for the land? No, because a village is made up of large family units. And there might only be 4, 5, maybe no more than 10 families, units that are part of this village. They all usually are related to each other and they're used to cooperating together. And when I'm talking about families, I'm not talking about just your father and mother and brother and sister. I'm talking about extended families. I remember asking one Bedouin man at Wadi Kelt, who I was riding a donkey, actually, of all things, and I started asking him about his family, and I said, well, how many people live in your family? I said, he goes, you mean my close family? I said, yes. And he goes, well, there's about 16,000 of us. And I said, you know all these people? He said, of course I do. They're my families. We all grew up in the same area, in the same village together. We're all related. Blew my mind. So large family groups make up a village, and these families actually live together in compounds. So that in Palestinian society, you have your home, and on one floor you have the parents, and the other floors you have the sons and their wives, and so on and so forth. So I'll explain this later when we get to Gaza. So this is a picture of a typical Palestinian village. This is taken from Sebastia in the northern part of the West Bank near the town of Nablus. And you can see the mosque is in the middle, central to the life of the community. But you can see the houses there are not individual houses like we would have. If you can see it close enough, you notice these are multi-story units, have many families that would live inside of these, and this is typical of a Palestinian society. And you'll also notice that the village is pretty concentrated in the middle, but if you notice around the outside in the forefront, there are orchards, and in the hills behind there are orchards. And this is very typical of Palestinian society. Live in the village, farm the land outside the village. Now, these fellahin have as they do their farming, they have their plots for vegetables and wheat and that kind of thing. But then they have these huge swaths of orchards, which they would have for olive trees or fruit trees or grapes. And these often are on the mountainside where the plots for the vegetables and things would be in the valley. And why this is important? Well, this is important because as they are farming and planting all these olive trees, for example, or fruit trees or grapes, they really don't have an understanding. They're not Westerners. They don't have a concept of individual ownership of the land at this point. We're talking now 2, 3, 4, 5, 800, 900, 1,000 years ago. So there's no sense of this land division. And they don't have an understanding of land ownership by an individual, because who owned the property? If they don't even use the word ownership, the land was made available to everyone, right? So there's no deed, there's no title, and the land just passes from generation to generation. But they're not thinking about, okay, I have to give my land to my oldest son, and none of the rest of the family gets it. No, these were just passed on from family to family and family. They tended them, as families, and the village worked collaboratively together, but there was no title and no deed. Here's an example. In the town of Batir, which is right outside the it's in the Bethlehem governorate, it's right outside of Bethlehem proper, is a town that's now been designated, a village that's been designated a UNESCO site. And now in that town, there are only 8 families, but the population is 4,500 people. So imagine if you were going to live with 500 people of your family all together in one village. This is what I mean, even today, this is how they live. But if you go through the history, you can see the Ottomans began a census in 1596. They didn't even count the people, they only counted the structures. But you can see that more structures happened, more people happened. But these particular terraces are significant because they go back to the 3rd century BCE. 5,000 years ago, the farmers on this land built terraces, and this is what they look like. This was to help with the erosion, and so you would plant your olive trees in terraces like this. You would use a terrace for your own individual plot, like this Palestinian woman in Batir, where they're growing their vegetables and this kind of stuff. And so this is the kind of agriculture that's been going on for 5,000 years. And in fact, in the town of Batir, here's a little teeny Roman aqueduct. I don't know if you can see it in the picture very well, but there's a man. See where the water's coming out? You see a man standing there? He's one of the members of these 8 families. They trade off every day, and they let the water come through this ancient Roman aqueduct to fill a spring that then they use to water all these terraces for all their agriculture. So this is a deep, old, ancient practice that people on this land and in the city of Batir, the village of Batir, have been practicing for millennia. Now, one of the things that you'll see in Palestine are olive trees. The first picture I showed you of that village was of olive trees all over the land. I heard the other day that 2/3 of the Palestinian territories is planted with olive trees. They're everywhere. It's a big part of their economy. They are lovingly tended by members of the family, and they've been standing, many of them, for centuries. And for the Palestinians, they are a symbol of peace. When we often see the olive branch as a sign of peace. But also for Palestinians, they also represent resilience and connection to the land, because the roots go deep, and olive trees can survive almost anything. Drought, inclement weather, those trees still stand, not after 10 years or 20 years, but after hundreds of years. And in the case of Palestine, there are olive trees that have stood for well over 1,000 years, and some as many as 1,500 years. It's a symbol of their connection to the land. They, like the olive trees, believe they have always been here. So here's a picture of an olive tree in an olive orchard. I happened to help harvest the olives off that tree several years ago. And so important is the olive season that in October, which is the harvest time, families return home. If they've been educated and moved off of the family village, they all come home to help with the harvest, and then in February they all return to help do the plantings of the young plants. This is a time of celebration in the family life where everyone comes and helps with the harvest. And this is what the bounty of olives look like. Like I said, they're a major part of the economy there. They're a major part of their cultural identity. Olives are very important to the Palestinians. But there's another group of people that are also in this area that aren't the landed farmers. They are our Bedouins. And Bedouins are our nomadic herders. They're the ones who have the sheep and the goats, and they have absolutely no borders. In fact, there aren't any fences, just to keep this clear. In fact, if you want to mark off your village land by something, you don't put a fence up, you plant a cactus. Because what? If you're going to have the sheep and the goats all going through the land, which they do, you got to find the greenest pasture, and that involves maybe grazing your animals, 50 miles, 100 miles, it's not unusual. Then these Bedouins really have no idea of individual land ownership. It would be like the Native Americans, right? They didn't think there was land ownership. The land was there. They were there to steward the land. And the same thing is true of the Bedouins and the Palestinians. They don't have a sense that you own the land, but the land was, you were in partnership with the land. And as you cared and tended for the land gave back to you. So, I have no idea what that slide is supposed to be. Let's see. Oh, I know what it is. This slide is a picture of the Ottoman Empire. Can't you tell? So I just wanted to remind you from our talk last week that this part of the world was that was dominated by the Ottomans, which are what we would call the modern day Turks today, from 1517 to 1917. And so this whole area is under their supervision. Now they started in 1517 to kind of be the overseers of this place, but it isn't until 1858 that they begin to say, maybe we should get people to register the land. This land that they have, that remember, they have no idea of individual ownership, because why do you ever register land, folks? Taxes and to conscript people into military service. So the Ottomans are like, we should register the land. And what they basically said was, it's not like you had to purchase the land. They didn't have a concept of needing to purchase the land up until this point, but they did institute what's called the Law of Moat. And what that means is that if you've cultivated this land, it's yours. And it even meant that land that had not been cultivated up to this point, if you planted trees on it, started a village, it was yours. If you used it, it was yours. So this is sort of how they established sort of the beginning stages of ownership, start with this Ottoman law of taboo in 1858. However, the Palestinians or not the Palestinians, but the farmers and the Bedouins, they're non-compliant because they don't understand why they would need to register land, because they don't have a concept of individual ownership. And so most of these groups don't comply, especially the Bedouins, but even the locals don't begin to apply because they don't think it's necessary. And of course, who wants to pay taxes if you can get away with it, and who wants to be conscripted into military service? But there are a few villagers who do comply. But for the most part, it's like, hey, Uncle Bill, you're going to be down the street by the land office where you're supposed to register. Could you just register the village for us? Because who owns the land, Uncle Bill or the whole village or the family that you're a part of, okay? And so this registration really fails. But then some of these land administrators exploit this opportunity, some that are there in Palestine and some that are elsewhere. And they say, if we register the land, then maybe it becomes ours. It means that the farmers that are farming that land and who have farmed that land, not for 50 years, but hundreds and hundreds of years, had no idea that somebody else had registered the land. Technically, they now become the de facto owners of that land, even though those absentee owners never visit that land, never oversee that land, never exact any produce or anything. But as we all know, as Western society is building, land is an economic advantage, right? The more land you have, the more wealth you can acquire. So, just to summarize a little bit, Palestinians have historic claims to the land. I didn't talk about this before, but Arab tribes have been present in this land since 800 BCE. So before the time of Christ, Arabs were there. Remember, at this time, there's no Islam. This is just Arab people, and in fact, in Acts 2, when we read the stories of how the church exploded in its growth in the second chapter of Acts, Arabs are listed as the group of people that are there. So the Arab people are present in the time of Christ and certainly 800 years before. In terms of the archaeological and written records that we have, that doesn't mean they may have been there even longer. The farmers and Bedouins have been here for thousands of years. They have a historic continuity to the land. They feel a physical connection to the land. They have a cultural identity, especially like with an example of the olive trees. And of course, they don't have any understanding of a nation state because Arab culture was not a westernized experiment. The West develops the idea of nation state, individualistic, ownership of land and these things, but this is not part of the Arab culture at this time. And so they aren't a nation state, so to speak, because it's not part of their culture to think of themselves as a nation. It's a Western idea that is really not part of their culture. So here's another picture of Palestine. I think you can see it, maybe you can't, but these are all olive trees. In the foreground, you can see the cactus on the side. This is also taken from Sebastia. These are the rolling hills of the northern part of the West Bank. And if you notice the road in the background, can you see that? That's an Israeli settlement in the middle and the heart of the West Bank, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about the religious claims, because we know that last week we talked about Israelis' religious claims to the land. So Muslims have religious claims to this part of the world. When part of the Muhammad's pilgrimage, night pilgrimage, is that he places, he lands in Jerusalem where the Dome of the Rock is before he goes on his night ride. And so the Dome of the Rock, that iconic dome, is the third holiest place in Islam. And that's part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which has deep significance to Muslim people. But also, what last week we called the Tomb of the Patriarchs is called Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. And this is their fourth holiest site. And that's because Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah are all buried there. The same patriarchs that Judaism has, Islam also honors. And they're buried at these tombs in Hebron. You'll always find in this stuff that each narrative names these places different things. So Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, that's what the Muslims would call it. It would be called the Temple Mount platform, or the Temple Mount to Jews. And then also the tomb of Rachel, who is also one of the matriarchs, is in Bethlehem, and this is also of significance to Muslims. And so here's a picture of that Dome of the Rock from the turn of the century. This is a center place in Palestine of Muslim worship. It's of deep significance to them. But then we also have the Christians who are there, Palestinian Christians, and they have claims, religious claims to the land too, because they claim Jerusalem. That's where Jesus was crucified and was resurrected. We have Nazareth, where Jesus, the story of the Annunciation, where Mary receives the word from an angel that she's going to become a mother. Bethlehem, where Jesus is born. The Sea of Galilee, all the places around the Sea of Galilee. So Christian Palestinians also have a claim to this land, and they claim a continuity back to the time of Christ. And they're saying our claim is at least 2,000 years old from the time of Christ. And here's a picture at the turn of the century of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay, so, wow, that's small font, guys. The promise to the Arabs, the British promise to the Arabs. So the Palestinians are going to critique this promise. I have to look this way, sorry guys. So remember I told you that the Ottomans oversee the Middle East from 1517 to 1917. And in World War II, they want to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. And so they make promises, the British Empire, to the Arabs, that if they help overthrow the Ottoman government, they will give them autonomy and self-rule in this part of the world. We spoke about this a little bit last time. Claire, if you could advance that slide, that would be really helpful. Okay. And it's already advanced, thanks. In 1917, we talked about this last week, remember Lord Balfour? He was a Christian restorationist, which meant he believed that the restoration of the Jewish people to the Holy Land of Israel would help facilitate the second coming of Christ. So he sends this letter to Lord Rothschild, we read this last week. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. The Palestinians say, those who didn't own the land made promises to people who didn't deserve it. You can imagine if you're an Arab living in this part of the world, you're going, excuse me? You are giving away, you're making a home for the Jewish people where we live. Who kind of gave you the right? You don't have sovereignty over this part of the world. So how can you possibly make this promise? But the Balfour Declaration goes on, which very few Jewish people will remind you of because it doesn't fit their narrative, but this fits the Palestinian narrative. And let's look and read what this says. So just on from that first statement, it says, "It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." So what Balfour said was, yeah, I want to create this Jewish homeland, but I don't think we should disrupt the life of the Arabs there. Now, of course, what the Arabs are going is, wait a minute, you made promises to us that if we helped you overthrow the Ottomans, that you would give us self-rule and statehood in this land. So to them, this promise of the Jewish homeland reneges on that. But the second thing that it does suggest that Balfour recognizes an Arab population in this land. One of the great slogans of the Zionists is a people without a land for a land without any people. And this declaration would say Balfour was quite aware that there were Arabs here and that he actually said their rights should be protected. So then what we have is the Britons, we talked a little bit about this last week, about how they went back and forth on promises to each side, but there are some significant promises that the Brits made to the Zionists. They gave the Zionists the right to establish their own military force, but not the Arabs. And they even went so far as to train the Zionist soldiers. And they allowed massive Jewish immigration. So think about that as these two groups are now, there's a huge influx of Jewish people into the land. The Arabs are really upset about it. They would love to be able to defend themselves, but that the Brits now are favoring the Zionists by allowing them to arm themselves and training them. You can imagine this doesn't go down very well with the Arabs. I have no idea what this slide is. Oh.
That is the historical slide. That one was trained soldiers.
Oh, yes, that's right. Annette helped me edit these slides. This was a picture of Israeli people in that time in jeeps and guns and all that stuff. This is a picture of immigration. So the British Mandate of Palestine, the tensions, as I talked last week, go back and forth, promises made to each side, and they all get mad at each other. But now remember where I talked about the law of taboo with the Ottomans? I should have told you to put a bookmark there, because I said that the Palestinians, as a rule, were not necessarily compliant, that we had absentee ownership happening, and it really is just sort of a jumble and a mess. But the Brits come in, and the British love to organize things. And so they say, we've got to do something about this messed up land system. They're Europeans. You need to have individual land that belongs to individual people. And so they actually end this Mowat ordinance and say, you can no longer just claim the land because you cultivated it. Remember, the Bedouin land was never registered. But the British begin to register and to confiscate and allocate this unregistered land. You want to guess who they're giving the unregistered land to as they're allocating it? Yeah, you've guessed it, to the Zionists. So in pre-1920, as the Zionists are beginning their movement to immigrate to Palestine, they gain access to the Ottoman records, and they begin to exploit the absentee ownership rules. In other words, they find the family or the person that registered, whatever limited registration there might have been, they make use of those records and they begin buying up land. So they're following the Ottoman rule, and they're following the designs of sort of Western understanding of law. But the Palestinians, this is not the way they see the world or the way the world is operated for them. So before 1920, the Zionists begin to exploit their understanding of the Ottoman laws. But then in the 1920s, when Britain begins to register all this land and tries to survey it, they actually give the records to the Zionists, which facilitates the Zionists now beginning to purchase the land. Of course, they did give these records to the Arabs, and what do you think happens? The Arabs are outraged, because now suddenly these farmers who've been farming on this land for hundreds and hundreds of years now suddenly have someone coming in with a piece of paper that says, this land is mine. And they're like, what are you talking about? We've always been here. And they're like, what do you mean individual land ownership? This is just not the way the world works for them. And so there's tremendous resistance. So we're going to jump ahead to the UN partition plan here, because this will help you understand the lands that the Jewish people began to buy up under the system. So the map on the left, this tan map, can you see the darker area in there? That's actually what, at the time of the UN plan, was the concentration of Jewish property ownership. Just because the Jews owned this land didn't necessarily mean that they were farming the land. Because remember, we have the absentee ownership laws. It means they have legal right to it, but it doesn't mean they necessarily have physical possession of all of it. But according to the UN, this is these darker areas are where the Jewish land ownership is. And all the light tan area would be what they would have designated as Arab areas. So when they draw up their partition plan, you can see that the red, which is what the partition plan originally thought would be in Israel, can you see how it kind of follows that same line? Except it expands those Jewish areas, but it sort of follows where they think current Jewish land ownership already exists. And they think the green is, well, that's just in general where all the Arabs live, or the Arabs would have access. Except if you could see the map, on the southern part, they're giving the whole Negev to Israel. So the UN partition plan, wow, that's a small slide. The population here is about 1.2 million Arabs, about 67% of the population. At this time, prior to the partition plan, there's only 0.6 million, or 33% of the population are Jewish. But the land ownership in this area, or land being used by the Arabs, if you want to use it that way, is 94.5% of this area, of that whole area, red and green areas we just saw, are owned by Arabs, and only 5.5% is actually owned by Jewish people. So when the partition plan comes up, it says, let's divide this whole area into 2 states. Jerusalem will be an international city, and then we'll transfer populations into these new states. And so they suggest that 19%, or 225,000 Arabs, should be transferred from their historic home into this new state, while they only suggested that 2%, or 1,250 Jews, should be transferred into the new Jewish state. And this partition plan involves transferring 43% of the Arab land to the Jewish state. Now remember last week, what did I tell you about how the Jews saw this partition plan? Woohoo! That's great, we get a good deal. But if you're an Arab, what do you think you think? You've got to be kidding me. Why would we transfer that many of our population? The slide's wrong. The number is actually 25% of the Arab population is 225,000 people. A quarter of their people are expected to pick up from their historic land and move. Arabs are not very happy about this, understandably. And they say, why should we give away our historic land? Why should we displace our population? Now, just to give you a perspective, in the United States, we have a thing called eminent domain. If you've ever had a road go through your neighborhood, or in my life in California, they were always building freeways. And I can tell you that in the cases of eminent domain, you might only be taking out maybe 10 houses, and yet you have people screaming, I was born here, I lived here, what right do you have to take away my house? And in this case, usually governments in the United States give tremendous amounts of money for you to be willing to give up your home ownership, but by golly, that's my home. That's where I was born. That's where my memories are. And you can't possibly give me enough money to compensate for that loss of land. So imagine if you're being asked to, if the statistics that I corrected earlier are anywhere right. 19 to 25% of the population has to leave, and you're giving up 43% of your land, you're not going to be very happy about it. And this is what the UN delegate from Egypt says. He said, if the UN decides to amputate a part of Palestine in order to establish a Jewish state, no force on earth could prevent blood from flowing there. In other words, by the fact that you're going to divvy up this land, you are definitely going to have war.
At that time, the United Nations was a newly established body from 1946, and that decision violated its own charter, because the charter of the United Nations, it doesn't allow the UN to dictate, give land to somebody from one group to another. So technically, the UN, was pushed heavily by Britain and permanent member of the Security Council. Even that decision, the UN has no right.
Right. So what Anwar is saying is that the UN Charter itself did not empower the UN to give away land. That is not part of their charter. And so even this partition plan violates the UN Charter, which is a great point. So let's keep going, though. So the Palestinians say, look, Arabs were not responsible for the Holocaust, and we are not. Why are we being called to solve anti-Semitism and genocide in Europe? It wasn't our problem. The Arabs didn't promise a homeland for the Jews. Nobody ever asked them. And should Arabs be responsible for welcoming all these traumatized Jews when you remember Europe didn't want them, the United States didn't want them? And then they say, why should a sense of Jewish nationalism invalidate our land ownership and our rights? And there are then some that say, and help me understand why somebody who says their God gave them the land 2,000 or 3,000 years ago is the basis for modern day ownership. What other religion could claim that God blessed them and their decision, and yet we don't give all those rights to them? So is the religious claim even valid? Just because your God 3,000 years ago said this was your land, that meant it's yours for time immemorial? The Palestinians feel like on moral grounds that they are being asked to bear the burden that is a burden they never asked for and shouldn't have been a part of. So again, this is our partition plan. I showed it to you a little while ago. There's the whole state of Israel right there. Red is the Jewish part of the state, and the green would be the Palestinian part of the state. And you'll notice that the big green blob in the middle, there's a green blob at the top, one in the middle, and then one off to the left side. They all just barely touch each other in these places. Not really what we would say would be a great way to have a state, right? Where you just have little points of contact. But this was the plan that the UN came up with. Well, it is a catastrophe in terms of the Palestinian perspective. They call what Jewish people would call the War of Independence, or the establishment of the statehood of Israel, they call it the Nakba, which is the catastrophe. And they say, wow, the Arabs go to war with Israel, and at the end of this war, it's just a mess. There are some very small number of Arabs that are staying in Israel. Most go to the West Bank, which are because we'll talk about that, they fled from their homes. That's annexed by Jordan. The Gaza Strip is annexed by Egypt, although annex is probably not the right word. Egypt exerts military occupation over Gaza. They really never annex Gaza and keep it under military occupation. Jerusalem becomes a divided city instead of an international city, and that's where we have, when you hear people talk about East and West Jerusalem was in Israel, East Jerusalem was part of Jordan. And then we also have, you'll hear this a lot, the Green Line. And the Green Line is the demarcation of that now kidney bean and Gaza. These were the borders after 1948. And in that Green Line would be a demilitarized zone, so that the two sides, because they're in conflict, have a certain safety berm between them. But this Green Line you'll hear a lot when you hear about what the border should be of a new state or whatever, and you'll hear people say it should go back to the 1948 Green Line. And here is the map of what we're talking about. Here's on the left is the partition plan, and this is what happens after the war. Again, this is my kidney bean analogy, and Gaza, you can see, is bigger than it is now. But you can see right in the middle, you see the word Ramallah, but right before it, because Jerusalem is in pink, there's like a little circle around that center part. That's Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is split right down the middle. The old historic part of Jerusalem is in East Jerusalem under Jordanian control, and the western part of the city is under Israeli control. So this Palestinian Nakba, let's talk about what it was. So it's a people crisis for the Arabs. Of the about 900, close to 1 million Arabs that were living in the land at the time, 750 Arabs are forced to leave their homes. Israeli narrative, you'll notice last week, they voluntarily left. From the Palestinian perspective, they were forced to leave their homes. And there's a lot that, if you want to read more about this, you could read more about this perspective. But just to say, 750,000 people were forced to leave their home. They were also thought, when they left, that it was temporary. They would have to go because of the war. They would be allowed back to their home. Remember and keep in mind how important the land is to the Arabs. They would never have left their homes voluntarily or fled from them. It's not a part of their culture. Their history, their connection is to the land. But 150,000 Arabs remain in the state of Israel, in this new state. We'll talk about what happens to them in a moment. The land loss to the Arabs is that they lost 78% of their ancestral home, and over 400 villages were destroyed in the war. Some in the war and some after the war. We talked just yesterday about how Israel, or last week, about how Israel repurposed, renamed, and in some cases they would level Palestinian villages and put other types of businesses or plant trees or other things to erase the sense that these villages ever existed.
Sorry to interrupt. You said 150,000 stayed. Did they choose to stay? Like they had the option?
The 150,000 Arabs that stayed. The question is, why did those 150,000 people stay?
Why were 750,000 forced to leave, but those guys, other guys were...
So it has to do with the fact of that. It has to do with the question is, why did 750,000 leave? They were fleeing armed conflict. The 150,000 that stay were living or staying or didn't flee in that conflict. Their villages weren't emptied out for whatever reason. And their villages or their ability to stay is connected that those villages were in Israel proper when the state was formed. So a place like Nazareth, right, where Mary hears from the angel Gabriel, is in Israel proper, and it's an Arab city. The Arabs that were there, very few, strong Christian presence, Muslim presence as well, had been there continuously. For whatever reasons, that city was not emptied out during the war. And so those Israelis stayed and formed this nexus of this 150,000 Arabs that then becomes many more as time goes on. But what I want to say in all of that is that, I'm going to talk about those Arabs in a minute. Just let me say. So here is a Palestinian man holding a key. The key is one of the symbols of the Nakba, because the Palestinians locked their doors and took their keys with them, expecting that they would be able to come home and use the key to open the door. If you're voluntarily fleeing and don't think you're ever going to come back, who cares if you locked the front door, right? So you will find almost in any Palestinian home, you will find somebody who has one of their ancient keys. They still keep them to this day. This is a picture of immigrants leaving Palestine. This is a picture of a UN camp. All of these 750,000 people that flee become refugees, and they are in camps all over the Middle East. A third of them go to the West Bank, a third of them go to Gaza, and a third of them go to Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. And currently, well, you can't see this one either, there are 5.9 million refugees throughout this part of the world. So, Palestinian resolve. What comes after this? Palestinians have been displaced. And their resolve at this time in 1948 is that this land is ours. They want to correct this injustice. They insist that they must return home. After all, for a Palestinian, the land and family is everything. They also say at this point the Arab nations must stand with us and for us. And we're going to use whatever we need, whatever means we have to meet this goal. For a Palestinian, this longing to return home is a part of the internalized fabric. It's like a pigeon that has a homing mechanism. Home is everything, and where home is where your land and your ancestral land is. So for them, this is a catastrophe that is hardly able to be put into words. To be separated from your land is like as if your family was forcibly separated from one another. It would be like if you, as a person, somebody came up on the street and took your baby. You would be heartbroken. You would demand justice. It would be unthinkable. It's a great tragedy. So not only do we have people fleeing, but this breaks up families and all sorts of stuff, but this land, our home, we must be able to go back. And this connection and this depth of this feeling is very much a part of the Palestinian psyche. Now, I want to remind you, though, of the difference between a refugee, which these people become, and an immigrant. A refugee is someone who involuntarily is forced to relocate to another country, and their longing is to return. Where an immigrant voluntarily goes to another country and hopes for a better life. There's two very different things, and these are Palestinian refugees, not Palestinian immigrants. So that even when you find Palestinians here in the United States, people say, well, tell me, why wouldn't you just want to stay here? Isn't life better here? Why would the West Bank be any better? For heaven's sakes, all we hear about all the injustices there, it's because as a refugee, they long to go back home. Somebody forced this on them, and they never lose that sense of home is where my heart is. I want to tell you a story about how this came home to me. This is a coffee shop in Berkeley, California. It's on my way to how I used to travel to go to my church in Berkeley. It's on Telegraph Avenue for those Californians who are listening. It's called the Mudraker Cafe. It's right by the junior high school, right before you get into the heart of Telegraph Avenue. And I would go and get coffee here like every other day or so, and I noticed the guy behind the counter. And once you've been in this part of the world, you sort of can pick up probably an Arab, probably a Muslim. And more than likely, if you put all those things together and you see little clues, I wondered if he was a Palestinian. So I said to him one day, what I ask all people from this part of the world, what's your family name? And he told me, and then I said, well, where's your family from? And he said, oh, I came from Jordan. And I said, his name is Hazim. And I said, so Hazim, I said, was your family originally from Jordan? Because a lot of Palestinian refugees went to Jordan, and from Jordan went to the United States. Knowing that history, he looked at me and he said, well, no, my family's actually from the West Bank. And I said, well, where? And he goes, you'll never know. I said, no, trust me, just try me. Let me see if I know. He goes, well, my family's actually from Nablus. And I said, I've been there many times. He said, you have? And then his eyes teared up. And he began to tell me about his family home. He talked about the nature of the house and the trees that were in their courtyard. He talked about his family who were farmers and the trees that they had. And he could describe every single detail about this house and the property, but he'd never been there. As a Palestinian refugee, he's never been allowed to go back. But in that memory that was passed along to him by his grandparents, his uncles, his aunts, all his cousins, and his own parents brought this area alive for him. That's the heart of a refugee. That longing for home, that memory of home. And I think Hazim is like many, many Palestinian refugees. Their hearts are in their ancestral land. So in this, you can imagine, oh, you guys are never going to read this. This has to do with the UN declarations that are made. So you remember that the Israelis were very happy with the UN partition plan, and since that point, they have never obeyed any UN resolution since, including the first one, which was developed while the war was still happening. The war had not been won. And it says, refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest possible date. That was passed on December 11th, 1948, before the Arab-Israeli war was resolved. And then in November 1974, the UN passed a resolution that said the right of return, in other words, the right of return of displaced refugees, is an inalienable right. Then in 1948, they said compensation should be paid for that property of those choosing not to return and for the loss of any of their property or any damage to that property. Again, a UN resolution that has not been honored by Israel. In contrast, Israeli law said, and this is in 1948, that Palestinian refugees cannot return ever to Israel. And they said that even families that are split up or broken apart, in other words, if you were part of the family that was the 150,000 that was left in Israel, but you sent your family across to safety, there's no family reunification according to the 1948 law that Israel passed. They also say here that if the land itself is unregistered, or if the land has been abandoned, or the land is affiliated with the enemy, that this land reverts to the state and that no compensation will be made for that land. So again, remember the land that was all unregistered, that immediately becomes Israeli land? If it's abandoned, those 400 villages that they left, often at the invitation of the Israeli forces who said, you need to vacate here and evacuate, don't worry, you'll be able to come back. That land, because they considered it abandoned land, became Israeli public property. And if the land was affiliated with an enemy, who was their enemy? The Arabs. So we're talking about huge amounts of land confiscation going on. This is a picture of a Palestinian woman. There's a barbed wire fence between where she is and where her home used to be. And she's not allowed by the government in 1949 to be able to return to her home. There's a picture here, I have no idea, we'll keep going. Aliyah is in this case is the Jewish immigration. So while Palestinians are not allowed to return, and we talked about this last time, Israel granted the right to any Jewish person anywhere in the world to return and immediately to become a citizen. They used the confiscated land and homes that was left behind by the Arab refugees, and they provided these homes to these new Jewish immigrants. And the Palestinian narrative is, it's clear now that this land is for the Jews and no longer for the Arabs. So what about those Arabs, those 150,000 that Annette asked me about, that are left in Israel? They are granted citizenship in the new state. However, until 1966, they're treated as second-class citizens and have to live under the rules of military occupation. So while they're citizens, they're certainly second-class citizens, which means they had restrictions on their travel. They were subject to curfews, detentions, and expulsions at that time. So even while those Arabs become Israeli citizens, or have the option to become Israeli citizens, their lives are not given the same freedoms as Israelis at the time. And so this is, what does it also say about Arabs in 1950 and 48? They were prohibited from serving in the military, the Israeli Defense Forces, or the IDF. Why? Because they were worried that if they had to defend the country against an Arab country, you would never shoot your cousin who's on the other side of the border. They had restrictions on where they could live. In fact, these restrictions still continue today. In Israel, if you live in a Jewish town, you're like, it would be the equivalent of a homeowners association of that town, except these are small cities, not a neighborhood, can set rules that say Arabs are not allowed to live in these communities. They have a completely separate school system, and since 1948, there's been very little investment in their infrastructure. When you go into an Arab village or an Arab town in Israel proper, you immediately notice that there's not very much garbage pickup, the roads are a mess, and there's no sort of infrastructure that helps support these villages, unlike Israel proper, where the streets are beautifully manicured and maintained. It's quite a contrast. So let's jump ahead to the Six-Day War. Of course, we're just leapfrogging in history here because we're trying to give you an overview. In the Six-Day War, the Arabs called it the Naksa, or the setback. So the Nakba in 48, the Nasca in 1967 for this Six-Day War. And this is what Yigal Allon, the Israeli labor minister, said at the time. In a new war, meaning this 1960, the Six-Day War, we must avoid the historic mistake of the War of Independence, in other words, the War of 1948, and must not cease fighting until we achieve total victory, the territorial fulfillment of the land of Israel. And what he is referring to here is what you'll hear in the battle cries of both Palestinians and Israelis, that the land from the river, the Jordan River, to the Mediterranean Sea should belong to Israel, according to this. But you will also hear Palestinians saying the same thing. The land from the river to the sea belongs to us. But this is what Yigal Allon said. So what he's telegraphing is that part of the intention of the 67 war was to acquire more land for the land of Israel. So now we have occupation. Israel's occupying now the West Bank, and they've taken over Gaza. And so there's different rules that the international community has said you have to do in order to be an occupying force. And this is from the 1907 Hague regulations that defines occupation as a territory that's under the authority of a hostile army. And it's meant to be temporary, and that hostile army cannot have political sovereignty over that occupied territory. The UN also added to these Hague resolutions and said it prohibits the annexation of territory. You have to be able to provide the basic needs and facilitate humanitarian aid in that occupied territory. You can't transfer your population into that occupied territory, and you can't confiscate private property. If you've been paying attention to what we talked about last week, you can now begin to see where these are going to clash in the Arab narrative. It also says that part of the occupation is that you cannot use collective punishment as a way to control the population. And what collective punishment means is when you don't punish just one person who's responsible for the crime, but maybe you punish the whole entire family, or you might punish the whole village, or you might punish a whole group of people. So if you think about this with collective punishment, for example, if you perform any kind of terrorist act against Israel and you're a Palestinian, the Israeli government comes in and destroys the family compound of that person's home, even if the people in the family had no idea that that person was planning this or doing this, and they have no right to appeal. They also say there's rights that the accused have, which is that they should know what they're arrested for, they should know the specific accusation, and they should have a fair and swift trial. And we'll talk about how all of these things are violated in a moment. But after 1967, the Six-Day War, we now have several categories of Arabs, and this is where it gets complicated. We have Israeli citizens who are Arabs. We talked about them a moment ago. But we also have people in Jerusalem now who were living in East Jerusalem, but their status is not given to them as citizens, they're only become residents. Then you have Arabs that are living in the West Bank, and their status is defined by military law. And we have Gaza, who later on, not at this point, but a little later in 2007, become defined by a military siege. And then you have another group of Arabs that don't make the press very much, but these are the Palestinians who live abroad, including American Palestinians. And while we don't have time to go into this all tonight, each one of those groups has different rights. Even Palestinian Americans traveling in that part of the world have different rights than me as a non-Palestinian American. And if you want to ask me about that, we don't have time to go into it, but it's really eye-opening. Why would an American citizen, just because of their historic background, have different rights from other Americans? Bit of a challenge. But let's talk about these Arabs in East Jerusalem. Israel, they say, is not an egalitarian democracy. They're allowed to vote in municipal elections. They can apply for citizenship, although most choose not to. But they must maintain a continuous presence in the city of Jerusalem, or else they will be, they can lose their residency status. So for example, if you're a person who's living in East Jerusalem and you're an Arab and you say go abroad to study for 2, 5, 7 years or whatever, the Israeli government can deem that you haven't been living in Jerusalem continuously and can pull your property rights and your residence permits. There again is little investment in the infrastructure, things like separate schools, all the things that were true of Arab Israelis and citizens. No building permits are issued, and they confiscate property. And we can't get into all of this. I have no idea what that picture is, but I'm sure it's really interesting to, oh, there's 2 pictures. Oh, let's go ahead to the Oslo Accords. Wow, this is amazing that the technology has failed me so deeply. What I'm going to encourage all of you to do is I'm going to put a link to all of these PowerPoint slides in the live feed for these recordings, and you'll be able to click on them and see all the pictures that you missed. Okay, no, I'm fine. Thank you, Anwar. Thank you. So Oslo Accords happened in 1993. This is Rabin and Arafat with Bill Clinton. This was a significant moment in the life of the Palestinians because they thought they were going to get 2 states. The Oslo Accords were meant to be a 5-year transitional plan. That was in 1993, and we're in 2023, and Oslo is really pretty much a dismal failure as far as most people are concerned. But in 1993, there was huge hope. And what they did was they established the Palestinian Authority, who was supposed to become the authority that would be, as Palestine moved towards statehood, this would be the group that would be in charge of its governance. The West Bank is broken into 3 areas. I'll explain that in a minute. They were supposed to curtail the settlement projects. That's the Jewish Israeli citizens moving into the occupied territories. There was cooperation on infrastructure issues, security, and economic health, but it was, again, a 5-year plan to transition. And here's what this plan looks like. The dark red part is what they call Area A. You'll notice Gaza is Area A, and then you'll see these dark red sections throughout the map. Those are actually more city centers within the West Bank, and then you see the light-colored pink. That's what we call Area B, and the tan section in the West Bank is Area C. You can't see it very well on this map, but you can see a little bit of the yellow around Jerusalem and around where that little kind of extension is in my kidney bean. That was actually annexed against international law by Israel. And what this means is that Area A was under Palestinian civil authority and security. That's about 18% of the land, all those dark red spots. The light pink spots are Area B, which are under Palestinian governance, but under Israeli military. But Area C, the largest section, which is 60% of the land, is under Israeli military orders, both governance and military control. Let me ask you, where do you think all the settlements are? In Area C, because Israel has complete authority in those areas. So, from a Palestinian point of view, they say Israel controls all of Palestinian life. They continue to increase the settlements into the West Bank. We don't have an ability to protest or protect our property. We're detained illegally. We have an exploitation of our resources. There's underdevelopment in our economy, and there's a restriction of movement. And we're going to go through all of these really quickly. This, now you're going, man, Debbie, you're getting into the weeds on this. I can tell you that for every one of these violations, there are more. But this is so important to the Palestinian narrative because these stories are rarely told. So that's why we're talking about it. Remember, the group that doesn't have power is always trying to get their voices heard. And they're always going to highlight the nature of their injustice and want to make sure that the world hears, because the rest of the world glosses over it or doesn't hear it because they don't hear this narrative from the group that's in power. So settler encroachment, there's currently 279 settlements. About half of them are, they're all illegal under international law. Remember, you can't transfer population into occupied territory. So these settlements are all cities of Jewish Israelis in the West Bank, okay, or in the Golan Heights. There's currently over 700,000 Jewish Israelis that live in the West Bank in these settlements. Part of these settlements are that they have their own separate roads to get there, they have their own infrastructure, they have water, electricity, and they are under Israeli law, not under Israeli military occupation law. And the government announced earlier this year under Netanyahu that they plan to increase the settlements by 10,000 housing units and move 500 more people into the West Bank. 500,000. Did I say 500? I meant to say 500,000. Okay, and so this is where the settlements are. You can see the little dark dots, and if you were paying attention to our ABC, you can see these are all spread throughout the West Bank, but the tan part here is area A and B, the darker yellow. The light tan is area C, and you can see that the settlements are all in area C. This is a picture of Ma'ale Adumim, which is right outside of Jerusalem. This particular settlement has about 40,000 people in it. This is another settlement block in the suburbs of Israel in East Jerusalem. And this is another settlement. You can see a roadway going between them, but there's an Arab village in the background and a settlement in the foreground. You might notice that the settlement has a lot of green trees. That's because they have water, where the Israeli area has less, and so it's not as lush. Arab, yeah, sorry about that, thanks Annette. And this is an example of an outpost in the West Bank. These are 5, like temporary mobile home kind of things that they put up on a hillside. And then this will expand into a settlement. And you'll notice the roads that are all developed here. You can tell these are Israeli developed roads in order to plant this settlement here, because there's things like streetlights and infrastructure that helped build these roads. So the government, the Israeli government, not only financially subsidizes settlers living in the West Bank, they provide military protection, they build roads, and they provide infrastructure, improved infrastructure, and things like electricity, water, and specialized incentives for industrial areas in these cities. There's a lot more you could say about settlers, but we're not going to do that. But the more recent thing that's happening is settler violence has increased in the West Bank. And so they block access to land and water resources, particularly right now, as the olive harvest was going on, they block the Palestinians from being able to access their land. They destroy homes, cars, and other property. They destroy olive trees, these ancient olive trees that these farmers have been farming, or stealing livestock. They have been known to vandalize churches and mosques. They harass and intimidate, and they injure and actually murder. So here's an example. Oh, it's not here. There was a picture of a burning city here, and Hawara is the name of this place. It's a village right outside of Nablus. Everybody drives through. It's on one of the main roadways through the West Bank. The settlers came in February, and they basically destroyed this little city. You're wrong, Annette. That's not where it is. So, Annette helped me edit these things, but that's not where this is. So, they destroyed 200 buildings. One person died, and there were over 100 injuries. The IDF actually tear gassed the Palestinians who were trying to protect their home from being destroyed and their businesses. And there was no recourse for them for the settler violence. But even the commander in this area, an Israeli commander, said, I think this is the finance minister, this is actually The person in the Israeli government who's in charge of all the settlements and the development of settlements in the West Bank, this is what he said about this rampage. I think the village of Hawara needs to be wiped out, and I think the state of Israel should do it. 7,500 people live in that village. Claire, if you're able to advance the slide, that would be great. Let's see. So, political protests in the West Bank. Oh, we lost it all. Oh, there we go. You cannot protest without a prison threat there. You can be arrested for waving the Palestinian flag or posting online. Throwing stones at soldiers carries a 10-year sentence. And 1,264 people are currently in administrative detention, which means there are no charges, no evidence, and no trial date set for these folks. There's more about administrative detention. You'll have to read the slides. They also exploit resources like water. So Israel in 1967 took control of all the water contracts, including the aquifers under the West Bank, and then they sell the water back. They pump the water from Palestinian land and then sell it back at 4 times the going rate. Here's an example of both an Israeli city that contains Arab neighborhoods and Israeli neighborhoods. You'll notice the black tanks. These are water tanks because Israel will restrict water to Arab villages, even within Israel, as well as in the West Bank. So what you do is you have these tanks on top of your home, these black tanks, to fill up whenever the water is flowing, because you never know when they're going to cut it off. But if you look in the background of that picture, you'll see lots of apartments, but you don't see any black water tanks. Those are Jewish Israeli neighborhoods. These are right beside each other. They don't need water tanks because they have water 24/7. This is an example of places throughout the West Bank where water is not available at all, and they have to pump in or bring in water trucks. So then let's talk about development. You can't build anything in the West Bank if you're in Area C in particular, if you don't have a building permit, but they're rarely given. And they don't have to tell you why your building permit wasn't approved. But if you do improve your home without a permit, a demolition order can be issued. And so this is a picture of Salfit. This is Anwar's village, of a destruction of it was in an industrial zone in Salfit, and they destroyed the commercial buildings there because they didn't have permits with the Israeli government. But Israeli won't give you permits. Remember those family homes that I talked about that are one floor after another? Well, as your family gets bigger, you need more floors. If you add on a floor to the top of your building, you live in Area C, and you don't have a permit, Israel holds the right to issue a demolition, and to have your home is then under demolition orders. Some are carried out and some aren't, but this is from Anwar, who's up here in the front row from his village. So they destroy farmland. This is where over 800,000 trees have been uprooted and destroyed and burned by Israeli settlers. It's meant a loss of well over $100 million in income to the farmers, and there's no prosecution of these settlers and no compensation for the loss. And so here's a picture that Annette thought was earlier of this Palestinian man whose tree has been cut down by settlers. The tree is all but dead now, and just the agony. Remember I talked about how they lovingly tended these olive trees? They're like members of their family. If there's a third question, you ask a Palestinian what their family name is and where they're from. Even people that live in the city love to grow things, and if they have an olive tree on their property, they will show you. And then they will talk to you about how they harvested, and it's just a big part of Palestinian society. Freedom of movement is also a big piece of the Palestinian experience. You need permits to travel into Israel. So if you are in the West Bank, where I was in Bethlehem, across the checkpoint is Jerusalem. So I'm right next to Jerusalem. I could see it from my apartment. But I have to cross a military checkpoint. I, as an American citizen, could drive a car through that checkpoint. But if I'm a Palestinian that lives in the West Bank, the only way to get through that checkpoint, I have to have a permit from the Israeli government, and I can only walk through that checkpoint. And once I'm on the other side of that checkpoint, it's not like I can stash a car there and then drive to wherever I'm working or go visit my friends. No. Palestinians are not even allowed to drive in Israel. And so imagine you're a worker who's working in Israel, you cross a checkpoint, then you need to take a bus or taxi to get to your place of work. And then the last thing is these, you navigate, right now, they navigate checkpoints not only to get into Israel, but between Palestinian areas as well. There's like 100 and almost 200 checkpoints all throughout the West Bank in Israel. This is a picture of Kalandia. These are people waiting in line to get through the checkpoint. You can see they're out in the sun. It doesn't even show the building that they eventually enter into, but there are times when people are in these lines for hours. This is a picture, can't you see it, of people at the Bethlehem 300 checkpoint where people are like lined up they look like they're in cattle cars, like all squished into these very narrow places. These are what are called flying checkpoints. This means that Israel can set up a temporary checkpoint anytime they want and check the IDs of people, and so they're all over the place. Then we're going to talk about the separation wall, which I'm sure all of you have done. That's where they've confiscated Palestinian land. They restrict access to farmland. The gates or the wall goes through this. They can encircle the settlements, and they separate Arab communities one from another. And this is a picture of where the wall is in red. You can see how in some places it encroaches into Palestinian land. Right above the word where it says West Bank, and you see the W, you can see sort of a light colored red in there. That's actually where Anwar's village is, and there's a huge settlement called Ariel that's right in there, that the wall will go in and completely encircle that. But you can see how invasive that is into the West Bank. You can see where the narrowest part of our kidney bean is, where the wall is, that's all of Jerusalem and the walls around that. So there's also a security wall like this around Gaza. So the same restrictions of movement happen there as well. This is an example of the wall, and you'll see the Palestinian farmers in the lower left-hand side tending to their crops. Their ability to have access to their crops is dependent on the Israeli military. Even if this is land they've owned forever, they have to have permits to go through the wall or through the fence to be able to tend their land. This is an example of the wall that runs through the city of El Azariah, and it separates what is Jerusalem from one of its suburbs, and they just put the wall right in the middle. And so what Palestinians would say is all of these things altogether that I've been talking about would constitute the crime of apartheid. And human rights organizations have begun to level this accusation against Israel more recently in the last 3 to 5 years, including Israeli human rights organizations as well as international organizations. Of course, Israel will defend themselves and say this isn't true, but from a Palestinian point of view, they believe that they meet the criteria with the intent to maintain domination by one racial group over another. 2, that there is a context of systematic oppression by one group over another, and that they engage in inhumane acts. And so Israel, while denying this, Palestinians use this language a lot, saying Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid. And so this is a new sort of designation that is extremely emotional on the part of the Israelis who defend this, but this is what the Palestinians would say, let's just call it what it is, that we are treated not just like second-class citizens, we are treated inhumanely and subject to all sorts of injustices. And in this sense of apartheid, you can see that the Israeli domination, subjugation of one people to another, they exploit their resources, they've annexed territory, they moved a Jewish majority through immigration to develop a Jewish democratic state. They immigrated to replace the Arab population. The war in 1948 was meant to ethnically cleanse the land of non-Jews, and they've moved a large number of the Jewish people into this new territory all of which is against international law and would fit the definition of apartheid. Palestinians would also say they've eliminated the history of non-Jewish presence, Palestinian villages were renamed or destroyed, and they began to destroy the archaeological evidence of Palestinian life. When I showed you those slides at Batir, it's a UNESCO heritage site, Israel protested this because they did not want to have this city that's 5,000 years old, this area, claiming to have continuous occupation and people living there because it disrupts the Israeli narrative. So again, they're in places throughout Israel, they will only preserve the archaeological records that prove that Israel had a presence there, or Jews had a presence there. They will also say that the treatment of Arabs in Jerusalem and in Israel, they're treated as second-class citizens, but in the West Bank, they are treated under brutal military occupation, and in Gaza, as we know, they're under a siege. So what they would say, from their perspective, is that Israel controls Palestinian life. Every part of Palestinian life is ruled by Israel. They say, make no mistake, we can't do anything without this country imposing its will on us. There's a lot more I could say about that, but let's just sort of move on because I want to talk about Gaza. Gaza, this is a short history. They were ruled by Egypt after 1948, after the 1948 war, under Egypt military occupation. And then they were occupied by Israel in 1967, along with the rest of the West Bank. In the 1993 Oslo Accords, they were deemed an Area A, which meant they were under Palestinian governance and Palestinian security control. But in 2006, the Palestinian Authority held open elections, and in that election, Hamas won. And the Palestinian Authority did not want to accept that Hamas won, and so they went and had a little civil war. But in 2007, Hamas wins that day, and this is what starts the more recent narrative of Gaza. Hamas' political charter originally calls for the destruction of Israel, which is why they have been deemed a terrorist organization, certainly by Israel, by the United States, and other Western countries, because they denied the right of Israel to exist. Where the Palestinian Authority in 1993, because of the Oslo Accords, acknowledges the state of Israel. So this is a focal point that where it starts this more recent history of what happens in Gaza. So before the war, wow. I have to get closer to this, sorry guys. 2.3 million people, this is before the most recent war, 2.3 million people live in Gaza. 47% of those 2.3 million people are under the age of 18. There are 65% of the people in Gaza are refugees, and it's considered one of the most densely populated places in all of the world. Wow, aren't you glad you could see that? Oh, it's even smaller for this one. So, the economics of this place are that 45% of the people in Gaza are unemployed, 56% live at the poverty level, and 80% are food insecure. And part of the reason for this is that the Gaza blockade in 2007, they blockade this Gaza Strip by land and by air and by sea, which means they control all the borders of Gaza. And so they control the movement in and out of the Gaza Strip. They control the flow of humanitarian aid. They control the import and exports of goods and food. And they import water and electricity and gas into the Strip, which is why in the recent war, when they first announced the war, Israel said we were cutting off all of these resources, right? But let me just be clear that the export-imports favor Israel. Very little of what's grown in Gaza is allowed out for export or for economic development. Very few people who need medical care or could receive medical care outside of Israel even around the world, very few are given permits to ever leave Gaza. So this has been a blockade that allows a trickle, but not a flow in and out of these borders. Now, when we look at the facts, again, before the war, their infrastructure, 97% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable. Very little water is drinkable there. Electricity is subject to rolling blackouts. There have been times when they've had only 4 hours of electricity a day. More recently, before the war, they were having up to 10 hours of electricity a day, but not electricity 24/7, unless you were lucky enough to have built solar panels on the top of your home or your business. And they are fully dependent on Israel for fuel. More facts before the war. The mental and physical health? No, that's the wrong one. Oh, no, that's it. So healthcare, their facilities are overstretched. They can't meet the daily caloric requirements of their population. The life expectancy is 75 years old. That's 10 years younger of the life expectancy than in Israel, which is at 85 years of life expectancy. And infant mortality is 4 times the rate of Israel. So you can tell on a medical level, they're deeply suffering. And then on terms of mental health, because of the ongoing wars that have happened back and forth, there's psychological trauma, there's anxiety, there's depression, and in particular in the area of children, they have a fear of violence, they are sleepless, they have a lack of motivation, and they have an inability to concentrate, all related to the traumas that they experience. And this is Gaza before this latest war that started on October 7th. So the international community has condemned Israel for its treatment of Gaza. It said they were guilty of collective punishment, that they have created the largest open-air prison, that their policy of separation of Gaza from the West Bank, it's one way they've kept the Palestinian Authority weak, is by there's no exchange between them, very little exchange, and the disproportionate amount of military response with high civilian casualties happened long before the war. Anytime that Hamas has lobbed a rocket at Israel, the response has been disproportionate according to the international community. So you may be wondering, why on earth did Hamas, this little enclave that has all this injustice happening, why on earth did they want to slaughter these Israelis on October 7th? And I want to be really clear that at least the Palestinians that I talked to all have said this was a horrific carnage. Even though Palestinians may have empathy for the people in Gaza, and even maybe have an understanding of why Hamas is fighting against what they consider a brutal oppression, I have not talked to a Palestinian in the West Bank, I was on a call just 2 days ago with people from Gaza who did not condemn the brutality of what happened in Israel. They say that, and then they say, and you need to understand the context. So, this Hamas, why did they do this? One, it's part of their charter to destroy Israel. We know that, although that language has been softened more recently. But part of it was they were threatened by the normalization of the Saudis with Israel. As more Arab countries began to normalize relationships with Israel, this is threatening because the Palestinian cause is going to get lost. Remember, way back in 1948, what was one of the Palestinian resolves? That the Arab countries will stand with us and that they will fight for us and advocate for us. And so as more countries normalize relationships with Israel, this is threatening. But also remember that this normalization with Saudi Arabia has to do with the Saudi complaint against Iran, and one of the allies of Hamas is Iran. It's also that the US and Israel were perceived as weak. If you followed the Israeli news, that you know for months and months and months and months, they had been having demonstrations against the Netanyahu government for judicial reform that was going on. So the country itself was divided. And when the war started on October 7th, our Congress did not have a Speaker of the House, and so was really in this weak position. So if you're going to launch a war or a conflict, you're going to choose a strategic time. Israel's weak, US is weak, Saudis and Israel were getting closer to an agreement. And so to stop this, they wanted to revoke a response, and a response they got. Wow. I don't have this, I'd have to look this up on my computer. What the response is that in this, there were 14 and 5 Israelis who have been killed. There's like 3,500 Israelis that were wounded. On the Palestinian side of this equation, over 10,000 Palestinians have been killed. About just under 4,000 of them are children. And in this, in the West Bank, which is not involved in the fighting, because of the settler violence and the violence against Arabs as a whatever, there have been like 123 deaths of Palestinians since October 7th, as well as, I don't have my slide, I'm thinking of the 124, there's a small handful of children have been involved in that, but there have also been many injuries in the West Bank, and 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been displaced from their homes. So this conflict, while it's concentrated in Gaza with the bombings, there has been revenge attacks in the West Bank against Palestinians. And that's what that slide was going to show you in a beautiful, beautiful way.
Before I came here, I heard the news that 8 people were killed in the West Bank today.
Yeah, so what Charlie is saying is that 8 people were killed in the West Bank today. It was like 100, I had the latest report from about 5 o'clock today, or 4 o'clock today, that it was about 135, so that would make it over 140 Palestinians and the West Bank Earth. This is a picture of, in Gaza, of the refugee camp that was bombed just this last week. Yeah, Rod.
Well, my comment is that who's benefiting from this? And you know, what you just said, it's so much easier to see the splinter in someone else's eye than walking around. Well, guess what? Where are we right now? We are living in a lack of luxury with this place. And Israel is essentially the United States military base that has, you know, kept Russia at bay from Europe taking over the Mediterranean. And we got a lot of cheap oil out of that area. So we living in this country this time, and really, we have benefited from sacrificing the people, you know, and unfortunately, you know, I'm British, and I heard these stories that, you know, up until 1950, people lived, the brown-skinned people living in that area of the world were not even considered to be human beings.
Right.
And these, what you're describing are just mucky little details that are inconsequential in terms of the big, I'm taking the sarcastic point of view, but the big picture is that we living in this country right here, right now, have benefited from all this and the sacrifice of these people. And, you know, and we have kept our standard of living going based on what we're doing there. And we have to take some responsibility for that.
We're going to talk a little, not quite all of that, but some of that next week. What Rod was just saying is that who benefits, and that the United States benefits from having a military presence there that's been able to hold off people like Russia or now Iran. There's very complicated when you get into the U.S. part of it, but as I spoke about it last week, we give $3.3 billion in aid. 97% of that aid goes to military support of Israel, and Congress just passed an additional package of $14 billion in military aid. So that does, to that point, not only does it help with our defenses, but it also supports the military-industrial complex in this country. So. So I'm not going to get into all of that because I want to finish, but I would love to entertain that. The point being that what does the U.S. get out of that? I hadn't really thought about talking about that next week when I'm talking about peacemaking, but maybe we can address a little bit about that. Anyway, here's a picture of the one of the refugee camps in Gaza that was leveled by an Israeli bomb. It's just really overwhelming. Just so you know that the rules of war, this is from the International Red Cross and the UN, and there's a bunch of war rules, but I only am pulling out the ones that relate to this conflict, which have been violated according to the Palestinian narrative. The rules of war prohibit collective punishment, targeting citizens, You're not supposed to target homes or destroying the means of a civilian population's ability to survive, like water sources or crops. You're supposed to protect military personnel and aid workers, including hospitals and ambulances. The rules of war also include that if someone is injured, even if they're combatants for the other side, or people that are just in general sick or wounded, have a right to be cared for regardless of which side that they're on. And so in this particular slide, it talks about the number of hospitals and medical facilities that have been targeted. 57 ambulances have been destroyed. 18 of the 35 hospitals that are operating in Gaza are no longer functional because there's no fuel. So again, from the Palestinian narrative and from the international community, this is incredible examples of collective punishment. This is just a slide that also talks about the fuel for Gaza's hospitals. And so they're running out of fuel, which means they're not able to meet the needs of the people there. There are 5,000 women who are pregnant, ready to give birth in Gaza, and they do not have adequate medical facilities. I heard a story today from a good friend of mine in Palestine. Shireen runs the Aid Society in Bethlehem that has been collecting money to provide humanitarian efforts in Gaza and in the West Bank. Shireen's aunt was killed when the Greek Orthodox Church was bombed in Gaza. But what she went on to say today, which I had not heard, was that her other aunt needed hip surgery because of the bombing. And they did a hip replacement without anesthesia because they didn't have the equipment. Another person from Gaza, Yusuf Al-Khoury, said today in a video conference that he was talking about children and members of his family who had passed away. And in the case of one of them, because the x-ray equipment wasn't working, because they didn't have proper electricity, they couldn't properly diagnose his brother-in-law. And because of this, his brother-in-law bled out from a treatable condition. So this is the humanitarian piece. And when you're hearing people that you know talk about their family that have experienced this, I can't even imagine what that's like. So this is an incredible humanitarian crisis when medical care is not able to be carried out for the people who are wounded. And I think the one slide I had, I could be wrong, but it's in the tens of thousands of people that have been injured. I think it's close to 35,000 people have been injured in Gaza. So the Palestinian view of the war, this is a disproportional attack. It's a disproportionate lack of or killing of children and civilians. Israel is guilty of war crimes. And frankly, the most emerging narrative out of Palestine and also the international community is that there's accusations that this is ethnic cleansing, and actually it's approaching genocide. And so this is the Misgev report, which is issued on October 17th, or just 2 weeks ago. This is done by an Israeli think tank, and their paper was titled, This is the moment that a unique and rare opportunity exists to evacuate the whole Gaza Strip in coordination with the Egyptian government. And then the Israeli Minister of Intelligence on the same day issued this saying, the evacuation of the civilian population from Gaza to Sinai, the option that will yield a positive long-term strategic outcome for Israel, is the only executable option. So what they're basically saying is they should transfer those 2.2 million people off the coast into the Sinai, which the Palestinians are naming a second Nakba, displacing and moving, and what they would say, ethnically cleansing the land of these people and relocating 2.2 to 2.3 million people. The General Secretary of Amnesty International had this to say, for 16 years, Israel's illegal blockade of Gaza, the world's biggest open-air prison, the international community must act now to prevent it becoming a giant graveyard. So the world community is beginning to, in genocide studies, are beginning to say that the language of the Israeli leadership and their actions may qualify them to, if this keeps intensifying, as genocide. As you can imagine, these are really incredible claims and charges leveled against Israel. Of course, Israel does not say any of this, but the Palestinian narrative and being joined by more international voices are suggesting that the Palestinian narrative has the merit. Palestinians also believe that the Palestinian Authority, which you may be wondering what they're all about, most Palestinians think it's corrupt, it's ineffective. They posture, but they don't really do anything. They collaborate with Israel on security. They also say that the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner. To Rod's point about the amount of military aid that we give, $3.3 billion versus $150 million. The two-state solution is dead, in part because of all those settlements, and the one-state solution seems impossible. Do you really think that Israel is going to annex the West Bank and allow close to 7-8 million Arabs become part of their voting citizenry? They don't think it's possible. They also, in this, there's an Arab sense of resolve that they must avenge injustice. As you might imagine, as Gaza has been leveled, and these folks all have family members or people, again, what happens to one Palestinian happens to all Palestinians. They're very deeply socially, culturally connected. They are they want to exact vengeance against Israel. Although my Palestinian buddy I talked to today, who's living in the West Bank, I asked him about this, and he said, you know, their blood's boiling right now, but if there was a fair resolution to that, they would move to welcome. They said, you know, the Palestinian people are hospitable people. But he said the real reason is because we just want what everybody wants. We want to raise our families in peace. So he thinks this avenging injustice is temporary. I don't know. I'm not there. They also say that the occupation must end. Whatever happens in this region, the occupation is unjust, it's unfair, it's brutal, and it has to end. As an example, in the West Bank, even though the West Bank is not involved directly with Gaza, the West Bank right now is completely shut off. The people can't leave the West Bank. All the workers that had permits to work in Israel, all those permits have been revoked. And you can't leave the West Bank and you can't enter the West Bank right now. So the economy has stagnated completely. So the occupation must end. Again, the Palestinian narrative is Israel controls all our lives. And when they close all the borders, they're closed. We have no recourse. We have no place of appeal. We can't vote anybody in and out of office. 3.2 million people and 2.3 million people in Gaza, and we don't get to vote on anything related to what happens to our people. But also the resolve within Arab society is to strengthen their cultural ties, to keeping alive this sense of what it means to be a Palestinian, their connection to the land. They are also a resolve to keep investing in the education, especially of their children. It may surprise you that Gaza has an incredibly high education rate because the people there invest in education, especially college and university, multiple degrees, in the hope that when this conflict ends, their children will be able to have opportunities that some of the refugees have not had. There's an investment in education. Family is always at the center. And their resolve is, you've got to share our story and don't give up. The Palestinian people are among the most resilient people I have ever met. They will take the situation that they have and somehow they will survive. Nobody's going to starve them out, close them off out. They are committed to making somehow their people work, and they will do it. So this is part of their psychological resolve. So the question is, why the Palestinian cause? Why should you care? Well, they say Israel ethnically cleansed the Arabs from the land. Israel privileges with the nation-state law that we talked about last week, Jews over Arabs. Arab Israeli citizens are second-class citizens. There's apartheid in the Palestinian territory, and Israel violates international law and should be held accountable. And this is what they think and want Americans to hear and to be able to speak up for them. This is written by 35 human rights organizations on November 6th, so just 2 days ago, in Israel, and this is what they said. They said, "It is evident that there is no military solution to this conflict, nor can there ever be one. The only way to stop the bloodshed is a political agreement that will guarantee security, justice, and freedom for both nations." They went on to say, "There are no winners in war. Only peace will bring security." And as I said, these were signed not by international human rights organizations, but by 35 prominent Israeli human rights organizations, wrote this open letter and sent it to their government. So I just want to remind you that next week we're going to talk about peacemaking. If you haven't already been depressed enough by all of this, I hope you'll come and hear about what Christians say about peacemaking, what Jewish perspectives and how they approach peacemaking. But even more importantly, something you probably have not heard of is what is the Muslim theological perspective on peacemaking. Our narrative in this country is that Muslims or Arabs are all violent people. That's not true. And they draw on their faith just like Jews and Christians do, and they want peace as well. So I also want to invite you, if you haven't, to watch the previous talks. And on the live section of the Mount Washington YouTube channel, there's like a little section after the recording that has notes or comments or something. I don't know what it is. Anyway, I will put the links to these slides so you can actually see all the pictures. And you can actually see them, I hope, in the right font so you can read them. So I hope that will work out. But I want to end this story by telling a story about a really good friend of mine. His name is Khalil. I told the story last week of a man up in Galilee who is a Jewish Israeli, and Khalil is a Palestinian refugee who lives in Bethlehem. Some of you from our church will recognize the people that are with Khalil. Claire Nowak, who's running our sound and technology, and Jill Brokaw, who was on a trip with me 3 years ago and 4 years ago in Palestine. We actually celebrated and broke the Ramadan fast with Khalil as his part of his hospitality. But let me tell you a little bit about him. Khalil is just an ordinary Palestinian guy. And I met him while in line at the checkpoint. I was at the Bethlehem 300 checkpoint. For Americans like me, I can actually drive through that checkpoint, but they only let one car out at a time, and they search your trunk and check your papers. And when you arrive at the checkpoint, you may sit there for 5 minutes, or you could sit there for an hour, and you never quite know. Khalil is somebody who's always at that checkpoint every day because Khalil sells coffee. And Khalil doesn't own a car. He lives in a refugee camp just like 3 blocks away from the checkpoint. He makes coffee, brings it in an air pot, and then sells it to the people waiting in line for just a few shekels. And this is to support his disabled parents, his sister, and his growing family. So I had never bought anything from Khalil. I had never spoken to Khalil, but every time I was there, he always asked me if I wanted to buy coffee. And I treated him like sometimes how I treat annoying homeless people who want to wash my windshield at a intersection, like, don't talk to me, I don't care, I'm not giving you any money. But one day I'm sitting there, and the line's particularly long, but I'm the last car in line, and Khalil got to my spot, and there was nobody else for him to ask. So he's just standing there by my car. So he said, I don't have anything else to do, I was bored. So I said, hey, I see you here all the time, tell me about yourself. So he goes on, he tells me he has this little baby that's been born and where he lives, and I hear a little bit about him, but in a classic Palestinian fashion, he says, you should come and have coffee with my family. I said, really? I don't really know you. And he said, no, come. We'd love to have you. So he says, why don't you meet me? I have to do this work and stuff. He said, meet me at the front of this place, across from this place, tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. Okay. I'm thinking to myself later, as I agreed to do this was the stupidest thing I've ever done. I have no idea what his name is. I have no idea where he lives, and I don't know whether he's trustworthy or not, except that he was friendly to me. And I thought, I'm never going to tell my children what I'm about to do, which is meet Khalil at the entrance of the refugee camp where he lives. I meet him outside, and I'm thinking, oh gosh, Debbie, sometimes you are so crazy. But I said, hey, I don't really know your first name. Oh, Khalil, I'm Debbie. And he says, come, it's December, it's freezing cold, it's been raining, and there's no developed roadways or paved roads into the refugee camp. This is muddy and cold, and it's now dark, and there's no lights, and I'm walking through this area thinking, I've really had it. But then I come into Khalil's home. Khalil's home is probably one of the most impoverished homes I've ever been in Israel. It was, there was no central heating, even though it was probably maybe 40 degrees outside. And so as I come in, and I'm all wearing all my winter clothes, I come in and the family treats me like I am the queen. I'm offered the seat of honor. The baby, who's wrapped in 15 layers of wrappings, is placed in my arms. And I was able to have the only space heater in the home was put in front of me. And I spent about 2 hours with that family. Even though Khalil speaks very little English, I speak no Arabic, but between this, we have this amazing time. And as a result, Khalil and I become friends. He still sells coffee at the checkpoint. And if you come with me to Israel, you will meet Khalil, because as soon as you cross into the checkpoint, if Khalil sees me on the bus or in a car, he always greets me and embraces me. We'll jump on our bus and say, you're all welcome to come to our house for coffee if you want. But here's the story I want to tell you about Khalil, because Khalil is a very faithful Muslim. So when talking to Khalil and meeting his family, and then over the years getting to know him, I would talk to him about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he would say to me over and over again, Debbie, you have to understand that my Muslim faith says we're supposed to love everyone. He said, I don't hold any animosity against the Israelis. The occupation needs to end, but we have to, if we're going to get along to each other, we have to show love, which I found very impressive. But on one of my trips when I came back, there had been a Facebook post where Khalil had posted about the fact that there had been a night raid of his apartment. And Khalil had been set upon in the middle of the night by Israeli Defense Forces. They woke his whole family up, put them all outside, and then they beat Khalil, not the soldiers themselves. They put a military dog on him that headbutted him, and his whole face was bloodied and swollen, and his body was disfigured. And he had posted this on Facebook, so when I saw him about 3 months later when I was there, we went to coffee and I asked him about it. I was really trying to probe the depths of the trauma. I was really trying to hear if there would be now a change in his attitude, except what he said to me was, I still don't hold animosity against the Israelis. I said, Khalil, how can you say that? You were beaten. He said, well, it turns out I wasn't arrested, which was a good thing. He said they went to the wrong house. And he said, and I'm so grateful that I didn't get pulled out from my family. But he said to me, my faith says I have to love. And he said, if I let hate take root in my heart, then what possibility will there ever be of a future? It was such a moving experience for me. And if you were to talk to Claire and to Jill that night that we broke the Ramadan fast forward several years, they will tell you that Khalil, now in his broken English, a very uneducated man who's a refugee who makes his living selling little teeny pots of coffee, little cups of coffee at the checkpoint, spontaneously gave some of the most amazing charges to peace and to love between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And he based this all on the richness of his faith. So as we talk about this narrative, and we talk next week about peacemaking, I want you to remember that the ordinary people like Khalil, the ordinary Israelis and the ordinary Palestinians, they want the same things. They want to be able to raise their children. They want their children to be able to thrive. They want to be able to have a place where they can make a good living, just like all the rest. They just want the opportunity. And until we have a space and a place of peace, a place where not just nonviolence isn't the rule, but a place where people can live side by side, recognize the humanity of the other, and allow them in their unique expressions of that humanity and their faith. That's the kind of peace that we're talking about. It's the kind of peace that we believe Jesus promised us, and we're going to talk more about that next week. So I hope you will join us next week. If you missed any of the recordings, they'll be on Live Mount Washington YouTube channel under the Live tab. And again, all the PowerPoint slides, I'll put a link on there to my Google Drive so that you can look at it. Anyway, I want to thank you, and thank you for coming and being part of this tonight.